Hey folks, in this video we're going to go over how to send a real-time eligibility check in Stedi. First, we'll send an eligibility check in the Stedi UI. We'll walk through the required fields to send an eligibility check and review best practices for what exactly to send in each of those fields. Then we'll walk through how to send eligibility checks outside of the UI via direct API calls. Let's get started. I've begun by logging into my Stedi account, and I'm going to go ahead and click the New Eligibility Check button here. You'll notice that right next to it, there's a button for batch eligibility checks. We'll be going over that later in this video series. Since I'm in test mode in my Stedi account, I can load up a number of mock eligibility checks containing anonymized data. These mock checks are a great way to familiarize yourself with the request and response shapes as you get started using Stedi. We even have a mock check that uses the Stedi agent to resolve a common error response, and we'll be covering the Stedi agent in much greater detail in a later video. For now, I'm going to go ahead and select this Signa check. This Signa check is a great example of the core required fields for sending an eligibility check. Some payers may require more or less fields, so we'll go over how to adjust the fields shown in this UI form momentarily. But the vast majority of payers will require precisely the fields shown on the screen here, which are the member's first and last name, date of birth, and member ID, a payer ID, a provider name and NPI, and finally, a service type code. So let's talk through some best practices for what exactly to send in each of these fields. We'll start by scrolling down and starting off here. In terms of member data, once again, we need 4 key pieces of information, which are the first and last name, member ID, and date of birth. There are some payers who don't actually require all 4 of these fields, but the vast majority do. So we generally recommend sending all 4. A quick note here on dependents. You'll notice that this section of the form is labeled subscriber. But what if the member I want to send the check for is actually listed as dependent on the insurance plan? Well, in the context here of eligibility checks, a quote-unquote subscriber is essentially any member who has their own unique member ID. So if the dependent you want to send the check for has a unique member ID, you can simply send their info in these subscriber fields. In the trading partner service ID field down here, we're going to submit the payer ID. The payer ID can typically be pulled from the member's insurance card alongside their member ID. So, for example, since I want to send this check to Signa, I'm going to input any one of these payer IDs in this field. You'll notice that Stedi's payer network typically shows a pretty large number of payer IDs for each payer, and you can use any one of these payer IDs when sending a check to a given payer. So when sending this check to Signa, we can use 62308, we can use HGJLR, or we can use any one of these payer ID aliases. No matter which one I submit, the check will go to Signa. You can see and search Stedi's full payer network by going to stedi.com/healthcare/network. Moving on from member information, we need to also send some provider information. And the vast majority of payers simply need a provider name and the corresponding provider NPI. Some payers also require the provider's tax ID. Let's pretend that Signa happens to be one of those payers. How do I add a tax ID field to this form? Well, we can click this Select Fields button at the top of the form to add additional fields. For example, if I type in tax here, I can check this tax ID box, save selection, and now we can see I have the option to submit the provider's tax ID. That said, we strongly recommend against sending additional fields in an eligibility check unless you know with certainty that a given payer explicitly requires it. Always start by sending only the core required fields we went over earlier. Then you can make the decision to add additional fields on a per payer basis as needed, based on how the payer responds when you send them only those core required fields. With this in mind, I'm going to go ahead and remove the tax ID field that I just added. Getting back to the subject of provider information, It's worth noting that the benefit data returned by the payer will not differ based on the NPI we send in the request. Payers don't care whether you send them an in-network NPI or an out-of-network NPI. All that matters is that the NPI is valid. Now, some payers may check whether the NPI is credentialed in their system, else they'll return an error code. And there is also a small bucket of payers that requires you to submit an eligibility transaction enrollment in Stedi in order to process eligibility checks for a given NPI. But we'll go over transaction enrollment later in this video series. Finally, keep in mind that eligibility checks cannot be used to determine whether a given NPI is in or out of network with the payer. Payers typically do not explicitly indicate whether a given NPI is in or out of network for the patient. Finally, we need to send a service type code. Specifying a service type code, or STC, allows you to get back benefit data for a particular service. So, for example, if I wanted to get information about this member's mental health benefits, I would specify MH as the STC in this request. If I wanted to get back dental benefits, I would send 35. We strongly recommend sending only one STC per request. The reason for this is because payers are not consistent with how they may respond to multiple STCs. So, for example, let's say I were to try sending all 3 of these STCs in a single request. Some payers will, in fact, look at all 3 STCs in the request and respond to all 3 of them accordingly in their response. But some will only see the first and respond to it. Some may only look at the last, and others may even simply ignore all the STCs you send them because they don't support receiving multiple. And so those payers will just respond with general medical benefits. So it's best to only send one STC per check unless you are certain that a given payer supports receiving multiple. Okay, now that we've gone over all of these input fields, let's go ahead and scroll down to the bottom of this form and submit this check to Cigna. Nice, looks like Cigna is returning an active coverage indication for this member. We could click the View button on the left here to go a little deeper into the actual response that Cigna sent back, but we're going to save that for another video where we'll talk through what exactly comes back in eligibility check responses. Let's wrap up this video by talking through how to send checks and receive responses outside of the UI via direct API calls. So by clicking a level deeper into this mock Cigna check in the UI, we can navigate to this Raw Request tab. This tab shows me the actual JSON body that was sent to Stedi's real-time eligibility endpoint for this check. I've gone ahead and pasted this JSON body into an HTTP request client here. Aside from that JSON body, the only other thing I need to send is an API key, which I'm submitting in the headers of my request. And you can generate an API key in your Stedi account from the settings page. Let's go ahead and send this out as a post request to Stedi's real-time eligibility check endpoint. Okay, and we can see we've got back a successful response. That's going to wrap up this video. Today, what we went over is how to send an eligibility check in Stedi via both the UI as well as the API. Thanks for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.